Hello. Today we're going to be talking about motivation. So in today's talks we'll be talking about things like ways in which we are motivated, different types of motivation, motivated behaviors like eating, sex, that sort of thing. All our basic human drives and needs. And we'll talk about how we get motivated to make sure we meet those needs. So first of all, we'll be talking about what drives organisms to do certain things. So really when we're talking about motivation, that's what we're talking about. What makes a person want to succeed, and what drives our needs. So this is a basic introduction to what we mean by motivation. So motivation are factors that energize, direct, or sustain behavior. There are different kinds of motivation, different ways in which we can think about motivation. So when we talk about different types of motivation, we're talking about regulatory motivation, instinct, drive reduction, curiosity, approach motivation, and avoidance motivation. We'll start with the most basic, which is our regulatory motivation. The purpose of our regulatory motivation is to maintain body regulation. We talk about what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis just simply refers to the body's tendency to maintain equilibrium. So we maintain things like temperature, water levels, salt levels. Obviously, we have to intake fuel, output fuel. All of those things are part of homeostasis. This relates to motivation in that we have drives to reduce some state of need. So, for example, if we're hot, we try to get cool. If we're cold, we try to get warm. If we're thirsty, we try to get water. Hunger, we try to get food. These are basic regulatory motivations. So the way in which our homeostasis systems work are much like your thermostat in your house. If it's too high, your air conditioning comes on. If it's too low, the furnace comes on. And so you try to maintain some sort of equilibrium temperature in a comfortable range. Instinct is an unlearned automatic action that is triggered by specific cues and occurs throughout an entire species. These are simple biological motivations like salmon spawning, butterflies returning to Mexico, monarch butterflies do that, other kinds of instinctual behaviors, migration patterns, all of those. Humans don't really have genuine instincts that occur throughout our species. We have sort of some basic instincts like survival. We also have an instinct to protect our young. So it's one of the reasons why a crying baby is so difficult to ignore, because we have an instinct to solve that problem. Drive reduction really gets at meeting some of our regulatory needs, but also other types of needs. So this is a physiological or social need, such as hunger, that create an aroused state that motivates us to satisfy some sort of need. So we have all sorts of different needs. In addition to food and water and oxygen, we also have needs for things like socialization, companionship, that sort of thing. So needs are states of biological or social deficiency. Drives then are psychological states that motivate us to satisfy those needs. We've talked already about the reward pathway and how it creates what we call incentive salience. So that's one of the things that leads to our drives to go out and get those kinds of rewards. So that relates directly to these issues of motivation. Arousal then is a physiological activation caused by needs. So we get increased brain activity, autonomic nervous system responses, sweating, or muscle tension. So when we're in a high state of arousal, that means that we're kind of in a stressed state, and so we really need to satisfy some need because of that. So if we're hunger or in starvation or thirsty or cold or any other kind of state of need, we will then get into this kind of aroused state. So needs relate to drives, which relate to behavior. So nutrients are a need, hunger is the drive, and eating is the behavior. Cellular function leads us to need water, which is thirst, and so we then drink. So this is how this all ties together. This is, I think, a useful way of thinking about different kinds of needs. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's not based on any empirical data. But I think it's a simple kind of rubric for thinking about how our needs are met. And the way this works is our most basic needs are at the bottom. And so if our physiological needs aren't met, we're not going to get any further. So we have to have our physiological needs met first, followed by safety. We have to feel safe. That's then followed by belongingness and love. And once we have that, we have esteem. And then finally, we get what's called self-actualization, where you become the ultimate person you are meant to be. But I think at its most basest, lowest part of the equation here, we really do have to meet our physiological and safety needs first. And without anything else, we are unable to meet any of our other needs. So again, it's subjective but useful framework for thinking about motivation. And again, the needs must be met from the bottom up. So it's a relatively simple but effective way of thinking about motivation. Curiosity is another type of motivation. This is a drive to explore that does not meet any obvious or direct need, but this is often very adaptive. It's how we discover new sources of food, new sources of water, new mates. So this drive to go out and explore is innate in all of us. Not in all of us, but in certainly most species, we have this desire to go out and explore. It allows us to determine what's safe and what's not, and allows us to meet our food needs, our water needs, etc. Finally, we have approach motivation and avoidance motivation, and we talk a little bit about these when we start talking about how people behave in social situations. So approach motivation is the motivation to experience positive outcomes. We're mostly motivated by wanting positive outcomes, whereas avoidance motivation is a motivation not to experience negative outcomes. So we want to avoid negative outcomes, so people oftentimes will take more risks to try to avoid loss, are in a much more prevention-focused sort of mindset. Achievement motivation is a different kind of motivation from these kind of basic motivations. It's a desire for significant accomplishment, for mastery of things, people, or ideas, for attaining some sort of high standard. So when we talk about achievement motivation, we're talking about students who really want to do well. They want to master things. They really want to know things. As part of this, sometimes we talk about cultivating intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is a desire to perform a behavior for its own sake, to perform an activity because of the value or pleasure associated with that activity. So these are things that we're motivated to do because we want to do them for their own sake. Most academics have a great deal of intrinsic motivation. There's not a lot of extrinsic motivation oftentimes in being an academic, and so we do it because we love it, because there are rewards associated with it. We see in our students as they develop, because we want to make some change in the world, so we're intrinsically motivated to go out and do these things. Extrinsic motivation is where we seek external rewards and or try to avoid punishment. So extrinsic motivation is simply external. It's to get money, it's to get food, it has nothing to do with our own desires. It's sheerly for rewards and or avoiding punishment. So it is one way to motivate people, but it's kind of a terrible way to motivate people. So we really want to try to cultivate intrinsic motivation as much as we can by not using kind of rewards and punishments. So this is how we actually can be much better at motivating people. The first thing is we want to try to cultivate intrinsic motivation. We want to provide tasks that are challenging, trigger people's curiosity, that they find interesting and worthwhile doing. This is a constant struggle for instructors, because we really want students to enjoy the kinds of things we assign them. We want them to find them interesting. We don't want them to be drudgery. At least I don't. I can't speak for everyone. But I really want my students to want to do the work for the class, because then they'll get a lot more out of it, because it's something they really enjoy. You can use rewards as a way of informing people about their progress, not a way to control behavior. So oftentimes in academia we'll do things like provide people with rewards for having the best poster, to tell people, hey, great job, not to control your behavior, but to say, look, you've done really well, and you're progressing the way you're supposed to. You also want to pay attention, so attend to people's individual motives. What works for everyone is not, what works for one person is not going to work for everyone. And so what really motivates somebody, you have to do this on an individual basis. Again, really hard to do as an instructor, because you can't really come up with 100 different assignments. But from a work perspective, You really want to see what motivates people and try to cultivate that more. Another thing you want to do is to set specific, challenging, but attainable goals. So you want to make sure people are challenged, but they can actually attain their goals, because if they can't, then they're going to be completely, they're going to have some serious trouble. And because they can't attain them, then they're not going to be motivated. Finally, we talk about what's called optimal arousal, and this has to do with kind of our drive state, our arousal state. And if we're too high an arousal state, we're stressed, we can't concentrate. If it's too low, we're just simply not motivated to do things. And this is what's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And what the Yerkes-Dodson law shows is that there is an optimal level of sort of arousal where people are motivated, but they're not stressed, but they're motivated enough to really get a lot of work done. It's very similar to what we talked about when we talked about the region of proximal learning, where you want work to be difficult enough to be challenging, but not so difficult as to be frustrating. So this is what we try to do, is to keep people in this kind of optimal level of challenge, but not stress. So I want to next turn to some specific kinds of motivation, and focus a little bit on some specific motivated behaviors. I want to focus first on eating behaviors. Obviously, we eat to survive, but obviously that's not the only reason we eat. We eat because we enjoy it. We eat because we are stressed or depressed, or we're eating our feelings. There are lots of different reasons why we eat. So obviously the first primary part of why we eat is to maintain homeostasis, because we need food to survive. So that's pretty clear there. But there's clearly more to it than that. So we have to start thinking about what is it that drives people to eat differently than to just survive, because very clearly we eat far more than only to survive. The first of these have to do with learning and memory. We oftentimes eat at times because we think we're supposed to be hungry at that time. So we get hungry at times a day when we're used to eating. We've been classically conditioned to eat at certain times. So we're used to eating then, and so the external cues associated with when we're supposed to eat tell us we're supposed to eat. And so we do. And so it's one of the things you kind of have to very sometimes closely listen to your body to decide whether or not you're really hungry or you're just eating because it's what you're supposed to do at noon. What's interesting about this is some amnesia patients will eat 2 or 3 meals in a row because they don't remember eating the last one, and so they still feel like they're hungry. So it's a serious issue to think about. There are external incentives for how much we tend to eat. So availability is one of those. Many people will eat food simply because it's there. We call these sort of people externals. They're people who tend to be responsive to appealing foods and gain the most weight when it's around. So if there's food around, they're just going to eat it, whether they're hungry or not. It's one of the biggest things, if you're someone who's struggling with trying to lose weight, is to not have food in front of you all the time. So if you have potato chips, get yourself a little serving instead of bringing the whole bag over to the couch and hoovering through the whole thing. I've been known to do that, so it's not just something that some people do sometimes, but when it's around, you'll just keep eating them. And we often do mindless eating. There's some really interesting studies about when you're watching TV, people will eat and not realize they've been eating. And so one of the other things we talk about doing is being mindful of when you eat and actually have nothing else going on but eating. Taste is, of course, another external incentive. A variety of good tasting foods leads to more eating. That's no surprise. That's one of the reasons why restricted diets, people will often lose a lot of weight, but often why they can't stick with them. There's nothing special about the Atkins diet. It's primarily that you have simply restricted the range of foods that you can eat, and so people just eat less because there's only so much meat and protein that people can eat. They'll get tired of it. So any of those kind of restricted diets will result in pretty low levels, much lower levels of eating, because there's just not a variety of things to eat. So if you look at controlled, this is actually with rats. We have a controlled diet that's primarily just rat chow, and yes, there really is something called rat chow. And so this is controlled diet that fed the same thing every day. And body weight of the rats, maintains pretty simply. This variety diet, though, they're much more likely to gain significant weight if they're provided with a variety of different foods. There's a neural basis for hunger. We know that losses of both body fat and/or glucose can result in hunger. There's a whole complex set of mechanisms that's really still being worked out in terms of how weight loss affects your brain's motivation to eat. Your body seems to have these genetically predetermined what we call set points for fat storage. And so you kind of have this set point about how much fat your body thinks it's supposed to have according to your genetics. But we know you can get epigenetic changes, and that set point can change over time if you overeat. So your body then says, nope, this is how much fat I'm supposed to have. And it's really a struggle to get that down because your body's just decided that's how much fat it's supposed to have. There is a huge problem, as we all know, with obesity in the United States. We measure obesity in the really worst way possible. It's not the worst way possible, but it's a terrible way using what's called body mass index. And body mass index is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. To give you an idea, my body mass index is around 26, so I'm considered overweight. But the body mass index doesn't take into account muscle mass at all. And so there are other ways to think about whether or not you have a healthy weight other than just body mass index. But it does allow us to make some sort of overall observations about obesity. So if we start here, you can see in 1990, most of the states had no more than 10 to 14% of the population as obese. If you look at 2010, none of these states have less than 15 to 19% of their population obese. So let's take a look at how this shakes out over time. This is 1985, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. It's like this rapidly spreading epidemic that we really don't have a good handle on what's happened. We know part of it's diet. We have a much higher fat diet than we used to. There are certainly some states that have much higher rates of obesity than others. Texas has the highest obesity rates. So does Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. These states have really high rates of obesity. So we're talking about a quarter of the population who is considered obese. And that's pretty dramatic, for sure. So causes of obesity, we know genetics determine whether a person can become obese, but the environment will determine if somebody does become obese. And again, a lot of this has to do with things like trans fats and the way in which we have changed our diet away from whole foods, whole grains, added sugars and everything. It's a pretty tough problem. If you're interested in this, there are some great books. Michael Pollan's books are, of course, a really good resource to look at how to eat better. There are some things that correlate with obesity, so education is one of them. We often talk about how education is associated with health. You can see very clearly here that the more education you have, the less likely you are to be obese. Weight tends to peak in the 40s and 50s and then starts to drop off again. There are two things going on. Older adults just end up having eating a lot less. Their diet really changes, and so they oftentimes lose a lot of weight. And the other thing that happens is we're having a little bit of a selection bias in that people that are obese early on don't live to be 70, and so that's another problem there. So we talk often about what we call this body weight set point, and this has to do with dieting, and it's one of the reasons why dieting is so difficult. Your body has this sort of genetically predetermined weight that it strives to maintain. So weight loss triggers a reduction in metabolism, and then those effects can be cumulative. These results are a little controversial, and again, we're still trying to figure out how all this works. But we do know that the more you diet, the more you yo-yo diet, the worse things oftentimes get. So the metabolic rates can slow down. You can speed up your metabolic rate primarily through exercise is the best way to do that. There are artificial ways to do so that involve things like amphetamines, but those are not healthy for you. One of the things we often talk about are restrained eaters. These are chronic dieters who are prone to excessive eatings. They often rely on perceptions of whether their diet is successful or not. And so they don't eat when they're hungry. They just simply are trying to decide whether their diet is successful or not. And if it's not, they throw the baby out with the bathwater and just eat whatever they want.
One of the biggest things we have to try to do is to be mindful of whether or not we're genuinely hungry, and pay attention to that and try to eat more slowly, and listen to our bodies and say, well, I'm full now, I don't need to eat anymore. You know, the worst thing we've done to American kids is make them finish eating whatever's on their plate, because that tells them that they have to eat whatever's in front of them, and that can really result in some issues. Sensible diet and exercise is really the #1 way to consistently lose weight. It sounds overly simplistic, but it really is that easy. You just simply have to try to eat consistently, sensibly, more vegetables, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, that sort of thing, and increase your exercise. Again, always do that under consultation with your doctor. It's something to certainly have a conversation with your doctor about. I want to talk next about when eating really goes awry and we have eating disorders. The first of these is anorexia nervosa. This is a disorder in which a person becomes significantly underweight, yet still feels fat or has an excessive fear of becoming fat and refuses to eat. This is at its core really a perceptual problem. They see themselves as fat. When they look in the mirror, they see someone who is fat, and that's a really difficult thing to treat. So it's really hard to get people past this. Lots of work being done in this area. Very dangerous. Lots of people, lots of celebrities have died from anorexia. So really want to be mindful of this. If you or someone you know has trouble with anorexia, you really should go see your university counseling center. There are lots of resources online as well. Bulimia nervosa is an eating disorder characterized by dieting, binge eating, and purging, either by vomiting or using laxatives. Again, very dangerous. You can tear the lining in your esophagus, tear your stomach, and it's happened a number of times where people have bled out from using too many laxatives. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. And again, please get help, or get help for your friends who you think might have some issue with this kind of eating disorder. So one of the questions about eating disorders is what causes them, and there's no simple answer to these. It's most common in upper middle class, white, younger women. It's becoming more prevalent among men, particularly gay men. In both gay men and straight men, there is not only eating disorders that are occurring, but this perceptual problem with how muscular they are, and so you get this overworking out, these crazy workouts, and people again see themselves as puny instead of as muscular, and so it's this perception problem that we have to think about. Part of this has to do with, again, our focus on the ideal body. So we have this idea about what someone's supposed to look like. The problem is you can't look like this unless, one, you've been photoshopped, which probably this person has, and two, if you have something to do besides workout and diet. People that you see in these kind of catalogs, these kind of images, their job is to be skinny and in shape. And then somebody retouches them to make them look even better. You can't look like this and have a normal life. I mean, it's just not possible. And so this is a standard that we really need to just consider obsolete and think about embracing our a healthier look for all of us. There are some interesting experiments on eating. One experiment tested to see when or if participants would stop eating if their bowls of soup were bottomless. This was really interesting. One group received refills from a server. The second group had a bottomless bowl that actually refilled itself from beneath the table, which would just be maddening to me, because I'd be like, I'm never going to finish this bowl of soup. So it was found that those who ate from the bottomless bowl consumed 73% more and were unaware of doing so. They did not report feeling any more full than those that had the one that was filled from a server. So this research suggests that one of the best ways to monitor our eating is to count bites. And in fact, some of my former colleagues at Clemson University have an apparatus called the bite counter that will tell you how many bites of food you have taken. So that is one thing you can think about, is try to be mindful of that. The last area I want to talk about is motivation for sex. This is, again, an important primary motivator. Our desire for sex is necessary for our survival, obviously for procreation, but it's obviously not the only reason we have sex. The hormone dihydroepiandrosterone appears responsible for the onset for sexual desire, while testosterone for men mostly and estrogen more for women are also involved in sexual desire. Women's sexual interest is independent of her menstrual cycle, which, according to evolutionary theory, keeps males around even when they're not in their fertile part of their cycle. Testosterone, we think, may be the root of sexual desire in both men and women. Certainly there's some experiments looking at providing low levels of testosterone supplements to women who have low sex drives. Again, lots of controversy in this area. There are normal ranges of sexual desire from very low or non-existent sexual desire to very high sexual desire. That only becomes problematic if it's problematic to that person. Perfectly normal for someone to have low or high sex drive, as long as it's not disrupting their life or it's not causing them any distress, then it's no problem. In terms of sexual activity, men's and women's physiological responses during sex are somewhat similar. We talk about what's called the human sexual response cycle. These stages of physiological arousal during sexual activity were sort of pioneered by Masters and Johnson in the 1960s. We have an excitement phase, a plateau phase, an orgasm phase, and a resolution phase. So excitement is when we start to get aroused. Plateau is when we're starting to reach orgasm. Then, of course, there's orgasm, and then resolution is that period following. And in men, there's a refractory period often where an erection can't be obtained during that resolution phase. So there are many reasons why men and women engage in sexual activity. Not all of them procreative, of course. Most oftentimes it's more recreative. It's perfectly natural. This is what the human sexual response cycle looks like. Again, relatively similar for men and women. You have excitement, and then you can sort of dance around plateauing and then orgasming and then this resolution phase. One of the things I teach in my human sexuality class for men is kind of how to make this plateau phase last longer by being mindful and paying attention to when you're close to orgasming and then stopping and then starting again, and so you can actually train yourself to last a little bit longer. Women tend to naturally last a little bit longer, which obviously can sometimes be problematic for mates to align their sexual responses. Why do people have sex? Well, of course, their top reasons tend to be that they're attracted to the person. They want to experience physical pleasure. It feels good. Women tend to rate showing affection higher, a little bit higher than men, but not much higher. So you can kind of see the responses are reasons for having sex are really pretty similar for men and women. Brief summary of human sexuality. Sex is like anything else. Learning and reward can play significant roles. Concepts of sex and gender are becoming more fluid. Very interestingly, if you want to study sexuality in males, particularly males, but also females, you have to be very nuanced in how you talk about sex. You can't ask people if they're heterosexual or homosexual because many people view themselves as heterosexual but also have same-sex sex. So more heterosexual males are reporting having same-sex sexual encounters. Perfectly natural. So there is a lot of nuance to trying to do this kind of research. Sex, gender, and sexual orientation all have both biological and social components. And again, without getting too deeply into areas that we cover in human sexuality, but these clearly do have both biological and social components. Pretty obvious that sex has a biological component. That's how our primary sex organs are generally formed. Not entirely genetic, but significant biological components, prenatal androgen levels, that sort of thing. Gender is a little bit more difficult to think about because it's such a social construct. Sex is a biological construct. Gender is a social construct. And then, of course, sexual orientation, where people have attractions to the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes, have both some biological and social components. So that's a brief introduction to human sexuality. If something you're interested in, certainly plenty of courses offered in that area. Thanks, and have a great day.